This is Dateline News and Conversation. Before I introduce my guest, I would like to remind you again to please join the Friends of Crimea, Friends of Russia Telegram channel by going to the link below and joining. You will find an aggregation of all the news pertaining to Russia in international affairs, the war in Ukraine, and the BRICS. I encourage you to join this channel for some real, honest, and good news about Russia. And now, my guest, returning after a brief hiatus, Alexander Mercouris, the Oracle of London. Alexander, welcome back to the show.
Delighted to be back again.
So, you have become very popular. You have tens of thousands of views. People all over the world are paying attention to your unique and astute analysis of all things geopolitical. But tonight, Alexander, I would like to focus on Joseph Biden. Now, I'm an American expat living in Russia. You're living in London. But everything that happens in the United States is affecting what is happening geopolitically and in Ukraine. But one of the things that I cannot believe is being overlooked is Joe Biden's criminal activity. It's beginning to come out, to seep out a bit in the United States. I don't know how widely it is happening and whether people are becoming more aware of this. But, you know, there's a video clip, and I'll include it in post-production, of Joe Biden threatening then President Poroshenko with a bribe. He said, if you don't fire the prosecutor who is investigating Hunter Biden's activity in Burisma, you're not going to get the $1 billion that we promised you. And then he said something like, and you know, the son of a bitch fired him.
I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid at the time.
So, Alexander, I would like your comments on just this video, which I should have thought destroyed Biden's possibility of being elected president, because this came out before that, and Trump even used it for a time, and then it just sort of went away. What is your take on that?
Well, the first thing to say is that this video has been around, as you rightly say, for a long time. These comments which Biden made, of course, he made publicly. He wasn't concealing what he was doing. He wasn't concealing the fact that he was putting pressure on former President Poroshenko of Ukraine to sack Shokin. He wasn't, of course, saying in these comments that Shokin was involved in a criminal investigation of a company, a Ukrainian company, of which Biden's own son was a director of that company. He didn't disclose that fact when he made those comments, but he made no attempt to conceal those comments. And of course, these comments have been out there for a very, very long time. Remarkably, very disturbingly, astonishingly, they didn't seem for a very long time to concern people in the United States. When the president of the time, Donald Trump, tried to touch on these topics in a conversation with the current president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, and suggested that there might be some questions about the president's activities in Ukraine, Biden's activities in Ukraine, and Hunter Biden's activities in Ukraine. Well, all that did was that it launched an impeachment of Donald Trump himself. So there's been a long story in the United States of people not wanting to address this issue, looking the other way as all kinds of information, evidence about what Biden himself was up to, was stacking up. And of course, this created on the part of Biden himself a sense that he could come out, that he could speak openly in the kind of way that he was doing, almost bragging openly about the fact that he was arranging to have people like Shokin fired, dismissed. What's happened, however, over the last few weeks, and it really is a story of the last few weeks, is that it's become more and more difficult in the United States to completely silence the story. More and more people have started to worry about it. An important and very powerful constitutional lawyer, Jonathan Turley, who is, of course, a professor of public law at George Washington University, he's actually now been saying that impeachment is the right course to follow in connection with what Biden has been doing. And I think that we are now on the cusp of the start of an impeachment investigation or inquiry, which people like Turley are saying is inevitable. But of course, in a sense, it's, as we say in England, a case of closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. All of this should have come out before Joe Biden was nominated as the Democratic Party's candidate for the presidency. It should have come out before he became president. It was an entirely valid topic to bring up during the presidential election in 2020, but everything was done to keep it quiet.
Well, let's dig a little deeper, Alexander, because I know that this rabbit hole is pretty deep. Not only was this bribery, it wasn't an attempt. He did it. He bribed Poroshenko. But at the same time, Hunter Biden's laptop became an issue before the election. And it is now known and coming out in the United States. And by the way, people here in Russia are also talking about it, that the FBI withheld this information, concealed it prior to the 2020 election. Alexander, you talk about criminal meddling in an election? My goodness, this is a classical textbook example. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, I think at first a few things I need to disclose. Firstly, I have had and I've given an interview with the person who disclosed the existence of the laptop, the computer repairman that Hunter Biden gave it to. He appeared on the Duran. We did an interview with him. I spoke with him at the time. I gained the impression that this was an entirely honest person who was correctly describing the events that took place. He's spoken about his deep disquiet about the contents of the laptop, and I've seen some of the contents of that laptop, and extremely disturbing they are. And of course, I know all about the information that is contained in that laptop, which of course the American people to this day don't fully know. So I find this an astonishing fact that this laptop, which this very same person handed over to the FBI, wasn't made the subject of an immediate investigation. And the fact that there was such an investigation connected to the laptop wasn't disclosed. So I'm afraid it begs some very serious questions about the FBI, about the conduct of the Justice Department, about the kind of actions they were taking, not just in the run-up to the election, but for some time before the election began, before, in fact, Joe Biden even became a candidate for the presidency of the United States. So that's one thing to say. The other thing that is extremely disturbing is that we now know that, in fact, this statement that was circulated on the eve of the election by a group of former intelligence officers, people who'd been working for the US intelligence community, which basically implied that this whole laptop disclosure was a Russian disinformation campaign. We now know that that was not only untrue, that was factually wrong what they said, but that there's now good evidence that that whole statement was circulated at the instigation of people close to the Biden campaign. And what is even more disturbing is, of course, there was a television debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And Joe Biden, who one must assume was familiar with who actually owned the laptop, was familiar with some of the contents, at least, of that laptop, would have known about the fact that his son was involved in all of these activities. Anyway, he hid behind the statement of those intelligence officers. He continued to give the impression, he allowed the impression to persist that this might be a Russian disinformation campaign, when he must have known, or he should have known, that that was not the case. And that was, to my mind, misleading the American people on the eve of an election. And I would have thought, this is my own view, that that is an impeachable fact in itself, because he was deceiving the American people about something very pertinent and relevant to himself, in which he would have known that if the American people had known the truth, they might have voted otherwise than in the way that they did.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty convinced of that myself. Amazing.
So I'm going to just quickly cut in, Regis. I'm going to say straightforwardly, the American people, before the election, had known what was in that laptop. I don't believe that Joe Biden would have been elected president. I think it is inconceivable that he would have been, based on some of the things I've seen in that laptop.
And I agree with you completely. And, you know, the Democrats, beginning with Hillary Clinton, played that Russia meddling thing with Russiagate, the Mueller investigation, all proved to be false, categorically false, made up. And here they tried it again. And, you know, this Russophobia in the United States is really become ingrained in the American people and the American political life. It's really, as you said, very disturbing. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this laptop. Not only did the FBI conceal this and directly affected the past election, it turns out that there's proof that the Biden family had been taking millions of dollars from foreign companies, distributing it to different members of the Biden family in all kinds of shell companies. Tell me a little bit about what you know about that, Alexander.
Well, before I say that, there's just two quick observations I wanted to make. I think this Russophobia that you're talking about, which is now being used in American domestic political battles is a cancer at the heart of America. It is now eating away at the entire political system and is causing damage to the way in which the United States conducts its political life. If Russophobia had not existed, we would not have had Russiagate, which, as you correctly say, was untrue. And we would not have had this whole episode with the laptop being basically taken off the scene in the way that it was. People would have surely asked questions. And in both cases, the outcome has been extremely bad. Bad, first and foremost, for the United States itself, for its political institutions, and for what it still claims is its democracy. So that's the first point I wanted to make about this. The second point is, and I just wanted to make this further point about the FBI. They had the laptop. They had the information about the laptop. All that time, all kinds of stories were being spread about Donald Trump, that he was in some way involved in collusion with the Russians. He was impeached because he raised issues with the president of Ukraine about Joe Biden and about Biden's activities. And of course, the FBI had all this information and they said nothing. They didn't say anything to Donald Trump, who was the president, their boss. They didn't say anything to Congress. They didn't say anything to the Justice Department, the Attorney General at the time, Bill Barr. They didn't say anything to Joe Biden or the Democrats or anybody at all. So they allow this entire impeachment process to take place with a vital piece of information, which would have undoubtedly affected the course of that impeachment investigation. They, in effect, concealed it. So that's the second thing I wanted to say. Now, let's come back to Joe Biden's activities and to Hunter Biden's activities. Now, we've now had an accumulating amount of evidence from all kinds of places and people. And I want to stress most of this evidence that I've talked about now is not really disputed. The president, Joe Biden, pretended for many years that he had no knowledge of his son's business activities. We now know that is factually untrue. There is a mass of witness statement that contradicts him. There is other evidence that shows that this is not true. We have situations where all sorts of mysterious payments were made. People have come up with a figure of $20 million. I'm not going to try and second guess the accuracy of that amount. Might be more, it might be less, but anyway, $20 million of payments made to the president's son. It is accepted by most people, including by lawyers like Jonathan Turley, that those payments were made in order to obtain influence. And the Vice President, Joe Biden himself, participated or at least was involved or at least was present in some of the meetings involving his son. There were shell companies, there were strange accounts, there was a widespread use of pseudonyms. The president himself, well, he wasn't president then, but when he was vice president afterwards, he himself used pseudonyms, basically to conceal his identity. And of course, Ukraine seems to have been only one place where all of this was going on. He was involved in, there was things going on in China, there were things going on in all sorts of other places. Lots, vast amounts of money paid. The assumption must be that the people who were paying all this money to the son were paying it in order to obtain favors from the father. And again, I think most people looking at this would say that the evidence that was the case is absolutely overwhelming to the point of being irrefutable.
Well, you mentioned earlier, Alexander, that there has been the beginning of an impeachment inquiry and the impeachment process in Congress. As this is being discussed in committees in Congress and and in interviews that they're going to be forced to answer to, the American people have got to come to some awareness of this, I would think. But I agree with you. I think all of this is impeachable and should have already happened. But I want to ask you now about the stumbling, bumbling, mumbling Joe Biden. You know, I don't get American news directly here, but I do see clips, and there have been so many video clips of him stumbling, of him mumbling, of him not knowing where he is, and outlets really from around the world have covered this. I want your opinion, Alexander. Now, whether or not you think that Biden's cognitive mental state and his physical weakness, which is obvious, are grounds for impeachment, for removing him from office because of the failure to fulfill the duties of the president. Your thoughts?
Right. Well, first of all, I do want to make one, before we get on to that point, I again want to make another point, which is about all of this influence peddling, as it's been called, influence peddling which came with large amounts of money. In other words, people paying money to the Sun in order to get influence with the father, or expectations of influence with the father. And of course, we are talking about somebody who was a United States senator and then a vice president, and who is, of course, now the president of the United States. So influence peddling on behalf of one of the most powerful men in the world. So I think that's an important thing first to remember, because the argument you sometimes hear is that this was not necessarily criminal activity on the part of the father. Now, I'm not going to get into this, but what I would certainly say is this. At the very least, there were colossal conflicts of interest here. Absolutely colossal conflicts of interest. If Joe Biden is taking political decisions involving Ukraine, for example, the fact that via his son, he might have been, shall we say, connected with a nexus of money and payments from Ukraine creates a conflict of interest. The fact that he never disclosed it is completely wrong and disqualifies him, in my opinion, from being president of the United States. So at the very least, I would say this was impeachable. I personally think that it is highly likely that there are other, that there are probable legal cases that could be brought. Cases, for example, for violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. I am not an expert in those fields, but on impeachment, about that, I have no doubt. Now, let's move on to President Biden's cognitive and physical problems. Again, I am not a doctor, but you see the man for himself. He is a shadow of the person he used to be. I was reading, actually, a few hours before we did this program, an article by a journalist called Andrew Coburn, British journalist, well regarded. He says that at the recent summit meeting, NATO summit meeting in Vilnius, several of the European participants were shocked at the deterioration of the president's, Joe Biden's, mental and physical health. Now, that may not be impeachable because it may not go towards the issue of his conduct, but it makes him, if he is unable to perform the duties of president, that renders him unfit to be president. And there is a mechanism in the Constitution to remove a president, a person who occupies the presidency, who is in that position. And again, I would have thought that would apply.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable, to see this man who is a shadow of himself, as you mentioned, not even be able to be coherent, to finish a sentence. and they're making, and then stumbling, and Donald Trump has been making fun of him about can't even lift his feet above the 2 inches of grass at the White House. I mean, I think it's just really a sad thing to watch, and I'm really surprised that the American people, by and large, are not coming to understand the seriousness of this issue that we've been talking about. Now, in terms of kickbacks, you know, Biden was Obama's man in Ukraine when he was vice president. He basically orchestrated the coup in 2014. He was behind it. Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt were reporting to him. There were several American congressmen, John McCain for one, who appeared at the Maidan and encouraged the people that America was behind them. It has been said, possibly rumored, but of the billions of dollars that has been sent to Ukraine by the United States, Joe Biden, Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey Pyatt, and others have been receiving kickbacks. Have you heard anything like this at all, Alexander?
Well, there are many such rumors. I mean, I'm well inclined to believe that those rumors are true. I don't want to make any specific allegations against any specific individuals because it's not proper to make specific allegations about individuals without actual knowledge. And I don't have that actual knowledge, but about the widespread assumption that Ukraine has acted as a laundry, that billions of dollars have gone in, and those billions of dollars have gone straight out again, and that a lot of that money has ended up in Washington. That is not actually controversial. I was looking, for example, at Ukraine's lobbying campaign in Washington, which, remember, is done, when we're talking about a lobbying campaign, we are talking about an awful lot of money being spent. And what I discovered is that it has been multiples greater than that of Saudi Arabia. The oil-rich, multi-billionaire monarchy, which has had this long-standing lobbying campaign in Washington. Well, Ukraine was running something much bigger than that. And where was the money coming from? Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe. It's got the lowest GDP per capita in Europe. It's poorer than Albania or Bulgaria or any of those places. It's obviously generates some money itself, but of course, almost by definition, one must assume that a lot of this money that went into Ukraine came out again, found its way through the lobbying system into the pockets of various people in Washington. And of course, that probably explains a great deal about the way in which Ukraine established this grip on American affairs. And of course, given that it was Americans in the first place who were making the decisions in Ukraine, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Maidan coup, it's not difficult to imagine. In fact, it is highly plausible that Americans specifically set it up that way. Now, you said that Joe Biden was Obama's point man in Ukraine. I would go much further than that. I would say that he was the de facto ruler of Ukraine during the remaining period of Obama's presidency. As I remember, he was even chairing cabinet meetings. There were Ukrainian ministers who actually had American citizenship, like Natalie Yaresko, who was an American citizen, was sent to Ukraine, was given Ukrainian citizenship so that she could act as finance minister of Ukraine. The United States at that time was micromanaging the system. The various members of the families of highly connected US politicians like Hunter Biden himself, his friend Devon Archer, who's connected with Secretary of State John Kerry. Well, they were all there. They were all involved getting lucrative positions in Ukraine, being paid large amounts of money, and this extraordinary system, as we've discussed, of money going into Ukraine and then money coming out of Ukraine, finding its way to Washington through the lobbying system. Well, that was set up at that time when Ukraine was under American supervision.
Let's talk about some of this money going into Ukraine now, Alexander. Reportedly, $175 billion worth of financial aid, military aid, weapons, etc., just from the United States. My question to you is, Alexander, when the United States has a national debt of something like 33, 34 trillion dollars and rising every year by a trillion or two, how is the United States able to continue to sustain this type of effort to keep this conflict going?
Well, it is able to do it because it has the reserve currency. It has the global reserve currency. And that means that the United States can be confident that when it creates money, which it's basically doing to an increasing degree, the US government now raises funds, not money, not so much by borrowing on the international money markets or in the domestic bond markets. It doesn't raise money so much through taxes. It is increasingly just magicking up money. I mean, it's been doing that now for many years. Started doing it even before, what was called quantitative easing appeared on the scene. But it is doing that all the time. It runs enormous deficits, and it's able to do that because as the dollar, the US dollar, is the world's global reserve currency, as all international trade, or at least the great bulk of international trade until very recently, was conducted in dollars. That meant that the dollar, however many dollars were produced, still retained value. So that the United States is not in the situation that other countries are, where if it inflates too much the amount of its currency in circulation, it risks running into hyperinflation problems. So that has given the United States this extraordinary freedom to maneuver and to provide vast sums of money to Ukraine. Having said that, there's two things to say. The amounts of money that have been sent to Ukraine are unprecedented. And I think this is a point people need to understand. I mean, there's been huge American investments in other countries, in South Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Nothing remotely approaches the scale of what is going into Ukraine. Now, if you're looking at the totality of money that eventually went, say, to Afghanistan, it was greater. But the United States was in Afghanistan for 20 years. The United States has only been supporting Ukraine for a much shorter period. And of course, since the present military conflict began in February of last year, that money that's going in has escalated. And I think that is now intensifying, not just within the United States, where perhaps there's fewer concerns about this than there are in other places, but I think that has intensified around the world doubts about how sustainable ultimately this is. I mean, even if you have the world's reserve currency, you can't simply create money indefinitely without taking enormous risks, not just with your own financial stability, but if you're running the world's reserve currency, with the financial stability of the entire world. And we've just been, in fact, we are to a great extent still going through a period of inflation, of very high inflation. And that is, at least in part, connected with all of this.
Alexander, at the same time, the BRICS and the BRICS Plus And apart from the BRICS, China and Russia, Russia and now Turkey, and other countries have begun dealing in their own currencies, not using the dollar. The BRICS have set up their own development bank, and the talk is they're going to develop their own international currency. What are your comments on that, Alexander? And it would seem to me this is very much opposed to the United States dollar and United States hegemony around the world.
Well, it is an existential threat to those things. If this structure that the BRICS are creating is successful, and I have to say the prospects of it succeeding, I would say, are high, then the entire American system that we have known for so long is going to become unviable. And it will no longer be possible for the United States to continue to do that which it is currently doing in Ukraine, for example, and which it has done in other places. And why is this happening? Well, there's two basic reasons. Firstly, countries around the world are indeed becoming worried about the fact that the United States is abusing its position as the holder of the world's reserve currency. They're worried that it is producing too many dollars and that it is producing too many dollars for the wrong reasons, and that the ultimate stability of the dollar is therefore in question, and of the entire US financial system as well. So there is that concern. But there is the further concern, which is that the United States increasingly, and especially since the period of Obama's administration, has been using the dollar and the fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency, not as a trust, but rather as an instrument of economic war. And of course, it started that with countries like Iran, and then it did it with Venezuela, and then it's done it with some other countries as well. But then, of course, it did it with Russia. And it used its position at the heart of the world financial system to do a whole number of things. Firstly, it seized, or it got its friends in Europe to seize, or try to seize, the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves, which of course are covered by sovereign protection. So that was almost certainly an illegal step. They've used their position in their control of the dollar to try to expel Russia, in fact, to expel Russia to a great extent from the SWIFT interbank payment system. And they've also used their position with the dollar, their control of the dollar, to try to impose secondary sanctions on third countries that want to trade with Russia. And countries around the world which have to trade with Russia, because Russia is one of the world's leading economies and is the world's leading exporter of commodities, of oil, of grain, of food, of many metals, of other things. And by the way, it's also becoming an increasingly important exporter of machine goods as well, just saying. Anyway, a lot of countries are saying to themselves, well, we can't accept this. This is causing disruptions to the world's system of global trade. But of course, moreover, and beyond that, what the Americans are trying to do to Russia, potentially, they will one day try to do to us. And other countries, and specifically China at the moment, which in manufacturing terms and in world trade terms is now a bigger economy than the United States, they in particular have become particularly apprehensive that the United States will eventually come after them in the same way. So that has led many countries, not just the original 5 BRICS states, but an increasing number of countries to say, we can't continue in this way. We can't continue to operate inside the dollar-based system, which is ultimately controlled by the United States. What we must do is we must set up our own global trading system, independent of and bypassing the United States and its currency. And we must trade with each other, initially, of course, in our own currencies, but ultimately, in order to develop a trading system beyond that, with units of account and central bank swap lines and all of the sophisticated devices that exist nowadays. In other words, we must create our own global financial system, separate from that of the dollar, in order that we can trade freely and properly with each other.
Alexander, we've been talking about some of the tools in America's toolbox for controlling and for influencing other countries and international affairs. But I've been focusing lately on other tools in America's toolbox, often referred to as soft power. That would mean things like the Peace Corps, going into countries and hear all these good things America can do for you to influence people, win the hearts and minds of people. The USAID, the National NED, the George Soros Foundation, and other NGOs have been meddling in other countries for a very long time. Wherever there's an American embassy, you see all of these plus the CIA. Alexander, I want to focus now on a country that has become near and dear to me because I've been there twice in the past year to renew my visa. The very tiny country of Armenia that had been very friendly to Russia. And they have a collective security agreements with Russia that as of today, as we speak, they are abandoning Russia and they are beginning this month joint military exercises with NATO. Alexander, put this in context for me, because this appears to me to be a pretty dangerous escalation and an attempt to create another front or to distract Russia away from Ukraine. What are your thoughts on all of this?
I think that's exactly what it is. Can I also say, of course, that it is extremely dangerous for Armenia, which, as you correctly say, is a small country in the Caucasus, surrounded by other countries which are not friendly to itself, and which has historically depended on Russia to secure its protection. The Russians have been the country that has protected Armenia since the 18th century, and which in the 1920s arguably ensured Armenia's survival as a nation in its historic region. So I think this is a very, very dangerous game that is being played in Armenia. But you're absolutely correct, because of course what happened in the 1980s especially, this is where it really began to take off, was that the United States started to recalibrate the kind of covert side of its foreign policy. In the past, the United States in the 50s and 60s and 70s had operated straightforwardly through the CIA, through the US Embassy. Its major contacts had been with militaries, with intelligence agencies. It had been very happy to foment coups and do all of those kinds of things. But in the 1980s, it began to look at things in a somewhat different way. And it created what you might call the NGO structures. And you have these large numbers of NGOs now covering all kinds of different things, seemingly, in many cases, benevolent, philanthropic agencies. They arrive in countries, they offer legal help, they offer help with humanitarian matters, they fund the development of educational institutions, all sorts of institutions in this way. And of course, they get some of their funding from private donors, and of course, some of their funding from the State Department, from the United States government. And I think what has gradually become increasingly clear is that this NGO system that has been created has become very much the vehicle for that process which has been referred to as color revolutions. So when you look at what happens in particular countries, you see the NGOs enter a country, they establish themselves within the institutional and civic life of that country. They win over important, influential people in the universities, the media, amongst young people who are, provided with a certain image of the United States and of the Western way of life. They're also, and this is important to say, vehicles for a large amount of money. And you see that these NGO structures are then used to carry out color revolutions in those particular countries, replacing governments which are seen as less friendly to the United States with governments which are friendly to the United States. Now, this happened in Georgia, and just as you are familiar with Georgia, with Armenia, my brother has been to Georgia many times and has come back and has told me that this is a country essentially run by Western NGOs. In fact, he was very negative about it. That's changed a little, but that's how it became. And of course, Georgia, a country traditionally friendly to Russia, a fellow Orthodox country, found itself in an armed conflict with Russia in 2008 with catastrophic consequences for itself. And Armenia has gone through the same process because the present prime minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, is largely a creation of this very same NGO system. And of course, he too came to power through what was in effect a color revolution. And he has been steadily, throughout the time that he has been prime minister, reorienting Armenia away from its historic relationship with Russia, trying to redirect it towards faraway allies like the United States and France, creating tensions with its historic ally, which is Russia, which is becoming increasingly skeptical of Pashinyan and of what he is doing. And of course, creating a situation where Armenia itself could potentially find itself in an even more disastrous situation than Georgia did all those years ago, 15 years ago, after the 2008 war. So it is a deeply misguided policy from an Armenian point of view. It's a policy that the United States is addicted to. It follows it all the time. What people in countries like Armenia and Georgia need to understand is that these people who come to their countries in the NGOs, who develop these color revolutions there, they're not ultimately friends of these countries. They're not even ultimately interested in these countries. They are serving the interests, the geopolitical interests of the United States. And of course, you are in close proximity to another country, which we haven't yet mentioned, or at least not, we have mentioned it in this program, but in a different way, where the whole NGO system operated on an even grander scale, which is, of course, Ukraine. And we see the catastrophe there that has led to.
Yeah. And you also have Abkhazia, which is caught up in this. You have the former Yugoslavia, with same thing happening in Serbia and Kosovo. It's really this soft power of the United States has been, in many cases, more powerful than the direct military intervention when you think about the entire landscape. Alexander, when we look at what's happening in the world, how this conflict in Ukraine keeps escalating, the United States continues to cross Russia's red lines. You have now the Baltics and Poland becoming increasingly more hostile and aggressive. It's even been reported, allegedly, that the recent drone that struck deep into Russia, came from Estonia. Alexander, Putin has said several times, if the Russian mainland, the heartland, is struck, that Russia will defend itself with all of its means. And people were interpreting that to be nuclear, that this could quickly evolve into a nuclear escalation. The question I have for you, Alexander, is it Putin and the Ministry of Defense and those people who determine what goes on in Russia have exercised the most extraordinary resilience and patience at these escalations? Alexander, do you think this is a sign of weakness, or is this a sign of something more important that's going on?
I think it's a sign of wisdom. I think that Putin and those around him understand that in the United States, they're dealing with an extremely dangerous country, capable of the most unpredictable actions. They understand that they are in a conflict with that country, which is a difficult conflict to navigate. And I think that they're trying to calibrate their responses all the time in the best so that they can optimally defend and promote Russian security and Russian interests without risking an escalation, which in a nuclear armed world could spiral out of control. So it's a policy of weakness. But unfortunately, what he does, and this is not just Russians who are saying this, people in the United States are saying this. They're interpreting it as in a different way. You see now, and you see this in many articles that appear from the extreme hardliners in London and Washington and Brussels and elsewhere. They say, well, because Putin isn't dropping a nuclear bomb when we send a drone into Moscow, that is a sign that he's bluffing. And we can go on escalating in an unlimited way, and we can take the most incredible risks. And ultimately, it is all a bluff. And firstly, I don't think it is a bluff. I mean, as Putin himself pointed out, the very fact that he made the decision to launch the special military operation shows that it was not a bluff. I mean, when he was talking about defending Russian interests, defending the people in the Donbass, he was serious. So he is not bluffing. But of course, beyond that, there is a vast amount of people in Russia who are saying, well, we're being shelled. We're having these drones sent to us. Everybody knows these drones could only reach their targets with the help of US intelligence agencies. They wouldn't be able to get round our radar systems if the Americans weren't telling the Ukrainians where these satellite systems are, for example. So inevitably, over time, and the more risks the United States takes, the more red lines it crosses, the greater the pressure on Putin is going to be. And there might eventually come a point where Putin has no alternative but to respond in a certain way. And then, of course, we could be in an extremely dangerous situation indeed. But I'm going to say this, Regis, and just to give a sense of how dangerous the situation has become and the nature of some of the people we are dealing with. There was an article that I read in the Daily Telegraph, which is a British newspaper, by a man called David Axe. David Axe is an American journalist, I understand, and he writes for Forbes, and he is exactly the kind of ultra hardliner that we've been talking about. And he says, well, let's do whatever we want against the Russians. They're weak, they're bluffing. We can attack them in all kinds of different ways and they won't respond. It's just a bluff. But then he went on to say, And if I am wrong and it ends in World War III, then don't blame me, blame Putin. I mean, it's so, I mean, he's prepared to take the most astonishing risks. And he says it's a bluff. But if it's all bluff, if it ends in World War III and everybody's destroyed because my advice was followed, well, it's not my fault because Putin presumably should just have been bluffing.
You know, Alexander, you talked about wisdom, the wisdom of Putin and his advisors. I hope that's the case. I tend to believe it is. Mm-hmm. And Russia's position throughout this conflict has been the ability to adapt to the changes that have occurred in this conflict. I'm reminded, and I was a big fan of Muhammad Ali, of the rumble in the jungle against George Foreman, 1972, I think it was, when he really was not the stronger and more agile fighter that he had been, employed the rope-a-dope. And people were saying throughout this fight, why is Ali just, leaning against the ropes and covering his body and taking these huge beating? This blows the body. And what he did was, over 15 rounds, he wore him down. Yeah. And he eventually knocked him out. Now, I'm wondering if this isn't Russia's strategy. America has been hoping to wear Russia down, but Russia has shown throughout this conflict and recently that it has been making tremendous gains in Ukraine, over 400,000 reportedly killed, some 60,000 killed since the offensive. Goodness knows how many people have been wounded over this whole thing. Their military is basically depleted, and most experts will agree with that. Russia has gained territory and has not lost any territory. And it is NATO and the US that are now beginning to say, we can't continue sending all of these weapons and arms. As soon as these new tanks come in or these new missiles come in, Russia's destroying them.
Yes.
Alexander, do you think this is kind of a reverse attack, that instead of Russia being weakened and depleted and exhausted, it's the West?
Absolutely. And I've been actually saying this in various programs. I mean, there's so many things to say here because, of course, what the great story of this conflict is the complete failure in the West to understand Russia, to understand Russian society, to understand the Russian economy, to understand, the fact that Russia actually is a mighty industrial power. This was something that was completely disregarded, that it's a mighty technological power, that it has a stable political system, that it has friends around the world. And it has important and powerful friends around the world, which it has known how to cultivate and to whom it has been able to explain things and to not only keep them as friends, but to eventually convince them that its approach, that its cause is the right one. And, well, we've just seen with the BRICS, we go back to the BRICS, all of those countries wanting to join the BRICS, partly it's because they don't like what the United States is doing, but partly, and this isn't something that should be disregarded, it is because they see what the other side is doing, what the Chinese are doing to some extent, even more what the Russians are doing. And they feel fundamentally sympathetic to it. And also, they see it succeeding. And it's succeeding in exactly the way that you said, because what is actually happening on the battlegrounds? The United States has been throwing every possible Ukrainian that it can into the battle. And it's not letting Ukraine end this offensive, which has caused so much loss of life, even though one gets the sense sometimes that some Ukrainian generals might want to see it stopped because they're worried about what it's going to do for the future viability of the defense of Ukraine. So they're throwing more and more men at Ukraine, and Ukraine is getting weaker. And they're throwing tanks and armored vehicles and machines to Ukraine. And as you rightly said, those are all getting burnt up on the steppes. And they provided Ukraine with shells and drones and everything of that kind. And they've depleted their own arsenals. So now the United States is out of shells. It can't supply proper shells. It has to reach for cluster munitions and other such horrors to try to keep Ukraine equipped, at least to some extent. And in the meantime, Russia is able to, has successfully conserved its forces, it's protected its territory, it's building up its army is getting bigger, its air force is getting bigger, its navy is getting stronger, it's developing more missiles, more technologies, and at the same time, and this is, I think, the greatest shock of all, its economy is getting bigger. It's actually returned to growth this year, and it's likely to end this year with a bigger economy than it had in 2021 before the sanctions were imposed. This at a time when most of the Western economies are sliding towards recession. So yes, the Russians have pursued this policy, not very different from that which Muhammad Ali showed at the Rumble in the Jungle, which, by the way, I also remember, and I also was an admirer of Muhammad Ali. But can I also say it's a policy which has been followed by the Russians many times in their history. It was also followed by the Romans. If you know Roman history, you know General Fabius had the Fabian tactics, which wore Hannibal and the Carthaginians down. And it's exactly what the Russians have done, and they're doing it extremely well. And people in the West, governments in the West, are becoming extremely concerned and nervous about this, and they don't know what to do.
Alexander, I want to thank you very much for this really exciting, interesting, and factual conversation. I wish you all the best with your shows, and I hope that you'll come back soon to continue the discussion.
Of course, I will come back soon, Regis. And can I just also say thank you both for hosting me, and thank you also for your exceptionally kind and generous words, both at the start of the program and just now.